Welcome to our quarterly economic webinar. My name is Kara Bloomberg, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Landrum HR. We're the parent company of HRQ. For those of you that aren't familiar with HRQ, we're a professional services firm with over 20 years of serving clients across the country. Our expertise is working with executives with three integrated services: enterprise-wide human capital consulting, providing interim talent, and conducting searches for HR professionals. Our consulting team brings a depth of experience in workforce planning and analytics, talent management and talent strategy projects, org design, and HR transformation needs. In addition, we provide HR on-call services and virtual learning offerings. In 2019, HRQ joined forces with Landrum HR to provide end-to-end talent solutions for our clients. Our other service lines include worksite management, a customized labor solution for companies that use large numbers of temporary workers, and we also provide PEO or full-service augmented HR. That includes payroll, benefits, workers' compensation, and HR compliance. You can find out more about all of our services by visiting our websites, landrumhr.com and hrqinc.com. Few housekeeping items. A recording of this webinar is going to be sent to everyone who registered today. Feel free to ask questions using the question pane in the control panel, and we'll try and get some of those questions to Brian at the end of the presentation today. The handout pane includes our September economic update. These updates are sent out monthly, and let us know in chat if you're not currently receiving the updates and would like to receive them. There'll be a quick survey that pops up as you exit the webinar today, and we'd appreciate your feedback. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Wilkerson. Brian has held senior leadership roles in both large enterprises and global consulting firms. He is a successful entrepreneur, having founded and led a consulting and software company that was sold in 2007. He's a deep specialist in driving innovative strategies and using cutting-edge planning techniques. He's worked around the globe. Brian is a frequent invited speaker and is sought by the press for his insight. He's authored a number of articles and book chapters. Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Kara. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone to our quarterly webinar on economic and workforce trends. I wanted to start out by giving an overview of where we are from an economic perspective, and then I'll dive down into some important trends on the economy and finish up talking about what companies are doing from a workforce perspective and some of the trends that we're seeing there. Unfortunately, at a high level, the news is not good from a GDP perspective. The real GDP decreased in Q2 by 31.4% from the first quarter. So that's obviously a pretty significant amount. You can just look at the graph and see the huge downward trend in that. We of course expected that there would be a significant hit from an economic perspective, but it was definitely deep. So we had seen a decrease in Q1 already of about 5%. So overall, the turnaround from a growth perspective in GDP has been quite significant. That really comes on top of having experienced 6 years of continuous growth, basically starting in Q1 of 2014. So the impacts have been pretty big. We officially entered into a recession in February, and that's continued to go forward. We'll get the first estimates of GDP for Q3 on October 29th, and we'll include some analysis on those in our next economic update, the one that Kara mentioned. To dive a little bit deeper into GDP and what's happened in terms of some of that, you'll see how the different sectors contribute to GDP. So consumers are about 70% of the United States GDP, and consumer spending saw a drop of about 33.2%. The overall drops in durable goods and non-durable goods were significant, but the worst drop was really in the services sector, where it was dropped by almost 42%. That really reflects a significant tightening from a standpoint of consumer spending, and has obviously rippled through the economy from an unemployment perspective and other aspects, which we'll talk about as well. So being a consumer-driven economy, when you have something like the pandemic hit, where we really locked down a number of portions of the economy, it's having a very significant impact. The second category that we look at is business investment, which makes up for about 18% of the GDP. Again, this has taken a very significant hit. It's down 46.6% from Q1 to Q2. When you look at the different elements of that, the non-residential versus the residential, both have taken significant hits in terms of business investments, as have kind of the fixed assets. Pretty much the only place where we've seen an increase in spending is when you get over to the federal government side. As we know, there's been a lot of stimulus, a lot of activity to try to stimulate the economy and try to keep things moving forward as much as possible. So you did see an increase from a federal perspective, but that's countered somewhat by a decrease at the state and local level. From a state and local perspective, we believe that we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of reductions in spending there. As most municipal and state organizations really look at hits to their tax base, both from a property tax perspective as well as from a sales tax perspective. Many of them are projecting pretty grim reductions in budget for this coming year and going forward. So we expect to see those numbers continue to decrease as we move forward, as the tax base continues to erode. From an export perspective, we continue to be a net importer. We have dropped significantly in terms of our own exports. We've dropped significantly in terms of imports as well, just given the lack of overall economic activity. But overall, the picture there is pretty bleak as well. Looking at the jobs front, basically, we have lost a lot of jobs in this recession. In March and April, we were looking at a job loss of 22.2 million. About 51% of those jobs have come back in the past 5 months, gained back about 11.4 million of those. But we're still, at some of the worst unemployment that we've seen in many, many years. Based on the pieces that I talked about earlier in terms of the historic growth trend, the Economic Policy Institute estimates that had we not had, the impacts that we had from COVID, we probably would have gained an additional 1.4 million jobs in addition to the ones that we lost if we would have kept going on the same economic clip. So when you look at the overall impact, it's not just a matter of the jobs that we've lost, but what would we have gained had we not fallen into this COVID situation. The other thing that's concerning is that the overall labor force participation rate has dropped. So we went from 63.4 to 61.4. That's actually about 4.4 million people who have left the civilian workforce. And there's a number of reasons why they've done that, which we'll talk about in a little bit more depth a little bit later. We look at both what they call the U3 and the U6 unemployment rates, because the U3 unemployment rate, which is the rate that you kind of hear published all the time, doesn't look at people who don't. It basically looks at people without any job but are looking for work. But if they're not looking for work, they're not counted in those numbers. So we look at the U6 to try to give a truer picture of what unemployment looks like. The U6 actually includes people who are working occasionally as well as part-time workers who want to be full-time. So when you look at the two lines, you can see that the U6 unemployment actually trends very similarly to the U3, but is actually much higher when you start to include those people who are working occasionally and who are part-time workers who would like to be full-time. So the full picture of sort of unemployment and underemployment continues to be pretty grim in terms of the U.S. overall. Looking at unemployment insurance claims, basically 857,000 people who have filed for unemployment in the week of October 3rd, 63.5 million overall, or about almost 39% of the civilian workforce who have filed for unemployment claims during the period of the pandemic. So significant again in terms of looking at the impacts to people from a jobs perspective, and obviously this ties into the spending numbers that we've seen earlier. The less that people have jobs, the less they're going to spend, and that has an overall impact on the economy. When you look at job openings and self-employed, some good news when you start to look at job openings. When we were looking at job openings, they dropped pretty significantly to under 5 million, in the April timeframe. Now we've had them bounce back to about 6.5 million, but that's still about 800,000 below where we were last time this year. So while we are starting to see some recovery that is evidenced by job openings, that's still below where we were a year ago. And again, sort of the reverse of the trend of growth that we had seen previously. We try to track the trends in self-employed as well, as many people try to substitute their overall economics or their overall income with self-employment when the job market overall is down. You can see very similar trend lines in terms of self-employment, and we've seen some bounce back in terms of self-employment as it goes. But for the first time, some of the stimulus that we had was really targeted at trying to help self-employed workers, and there's kind of a mixed feedback in terms of how much that's really had an impact. But we are starting to see some bounce back in self-employment as well, to go with some of the overall increases in both the overall economic or the overall job openings, as well as some of the increases in employment that we look for. So some positive signs to look forward, but we're nowhere near where we once were, and still a lot of concern for the economy going forward. Some numbers to think about when you look at the week of September 26th, about 12.1 continued claims for unemployment. So I talked about initial claims earlier, but these actually talk about sort of who's still on unemployment and are continuing to claim unemployment because they can't find work. So about 12.1 million people. Right now, we're looking at about a 4.75 or 4.7% change in hourly earnings so far this year. Now, that may seem like a good thing and a good thing that people's hourly wages are increasing, but the actual effect that we're seeing here is that many of the jobs that have been lost in the market have been on the lower end of the job scale, and so lower wages, a lot of hourly workers, and those kinds of things. So the net effect that it's had is to look at is to actually show an increase in overall earnings, but it's actually less people making more money if you look at what that number contributes. So that's certainly something of concern when we look at these numbers. One piece of good news, the consumer confidence index for September actually went over 100 for the first time since March. We were down in the 80s at one point in terms of the overall consumer confidence, and that's rebounded somewhat up to 101.8. A lot of question marks about how that'll continue, and a lot of it depends on COVID trends, as well as some other pieces from an overall geopolitical and macroeconomic perspective. Consumer price index about 0.4 for August, about 1.3 annual in terms of looking at the increases in prices for different categories of goods as we go along. So prices staying relatively stable, slight increase as we go forward. In many industries, they are seeing scarcity of components, long lead times, difficulty sourcing from offshore, et cetera, and some of that is contributing to increases in prices. But at the same time, there's still a strong desire for people to get sales, and so they haven't been raising prices as much as they've been experiencing price increases for components, et cetera. So that could change as the economy moves forward, and as people start to get, spending starts to increase, people may be trying to pass on more of those costs to the end consumers. But for right now, things are holding relatively stable in terms of those overall price components. Looking at some of the leading indicators, we try to get a bit of a sense in terms of where things are heading. We continue to see a decrease in commercial construction spending. Some of that is the overall economy, but some of it is also a rethinking in lots of ways about what the workplace will look like in the future. And we've been spending a lot of time with our clients trying to help define what does that future workplace look like? What does physical space and physical presence look like, and how will that work in the new world? Given not only where COVID's going, but just sort of what we've learned out of this economy and out of this out of the COVID stage. A lot of differences, a lot of changes that are going to happen and go forward in terms of the overall looking at workspace. So that's influencing some of the commercial construction spending as well. Overall, seeing some increases in the single family homes or one family home units that have been sold. Interest rates continue to be low, and those folks who can qualify and who can actually access some of those loans are taking advantage of that. But it's very uneven if you look across the United States in terms of the housing market and what people are seeing. So in some places very slow, in other places continues to be very is starting to heat up, and you're starting to see prices increase in terms of that. There are starting to be some pullbacks in some of the looser lending requirements and things of that nature. So we have some concern about this particular number and where that's going to go as we move forward. Another leading indicator is really around durable goods and durable goods orders. This is another area that we've started to see a rebound, which is a good thing, but that rebound is starting to flatten. As you can see, that curve starting to level off as we look at this most recent months of data. And we're still at a lower level than we were a year ago. So while, same trend that we're seeing in terms of jobs and some of these other metrics, while we're seeing some increase and while we're seeing some improvement in terms of these overall metrics, there is still a challenge in terms of getting back to the levels that we've been at. So it's likely that we're really going to see, sustained economic downturn for some time, given the numbers that we're looking at. We also, of course, want to look at things from an equity perspective and try to see what trends we can decipher from the market. When you look at, I mentioned some of the concerns about unemployment and people leaving the workforce, and you start to see some of these concerns as you look at things from a gender perspective. When you look at the numbers around unemployment, February versus September, in terms of how they've changed, one of the things that you see overall is that, women basically are a higher percentage of the unemployed than their representation in the workforce. And one of the things that's very concerning that we've seen is a very significant reduction in the workforce and women leaving the workforce overall. So August to September alone, you saw about 1,617,000 women leave the workforce as compared to 78,000 men. And when they've been surveyed and researched that information, there's a number of things that contribute to that, most of them not surprising. Access to childcare is really becoming more difficult, more expensive now that schools are back in session with these different learning models. Very often the role of the parents has become much more significant in terms of the need for them to, monitor online learning, participate in online learning, help with those kinds of things, et cetera. And so these are really leading to a drain out of the workforce that unfortunately is disproportionately impacting women. And it's a significant concern going forward in terms of equity and what we're looking at. When we've made some gains in the past in terms of women in leadership and things of that nature, and a lot of those are really at risk by some of the trends that we're seeing. And so these are the kinds of things that we hope to see more in the way of policy response. And as people are thinking about stimulus and things of that nature, we hope to see some action in terms of those areas to help turn around some of the issues that we're seeing. When you start to look at some of the numbers by race and ethnicity, and I think I've talked about this a little bit previously, but you start to see, again, some concerning trends. When you look at the green lines, which are the percentage representation in the workforce, versus the blue lines, which is the percentage of unemployment, we can see that, for whites, it's basically they're higher representation in the workforce and lower unemployment than African American and Asian categories when you look at those from an unemployment versus representation in the workforce. Similarly, when you start to look over at the Hispanic Latino versus the non-Hispanic Latino, you see similar trends in terms of unemployment rates being higher than their representation in the workforce. So again, we're starting to see some concerns in these areas from an equity perspective of the economy and the economic recovery disproportionately impacting different racial and ethnic groups as well as women in the workforce. So these are trends that deserve a lot of scrutiny and a lot of look at policy response. To dive into those numbers a little bit, right now the unemployment rates remain the highest for Black men and Black women. We've seen, as I mentioned earlier, about 4.4 million people who have dropped out of the civilian labor force since February. You can see some of the numbers here. 61% of those have been women. High percentage of Hispanic or Latino women who have dropped out of the workforce as well. And Hispanic and Latino men are actually the least likely to have left the labor force, doing a little bit better than others. But, we have a lot of concerns in terms of this. And again, it's not just a matter of the overall numbers, but when you look at long-term trends and trying to look at, career paths, career trajectories, things of that nature, these kinds of exits from the workforce become very concerning as you look at it. It also, in many ways, when you have you've had two spouses working in the past, it's impacting the overall ability of people to spend and sort of keep the economy going. So when I talked earlier about the consumer trends and some of the issues that we see there, they're multifaceted in terms of why we see such a significant reduction in consumer spending. It's not just jobs, but it's also, one wage earner leaving the workforce and in order to have to take care of kids or help deal with homeschooling or some of those kinds of things. So there's just a lot of issues and concerns that we start to see in the numbers that really deserve sort of a broader response and for us to look at those much more closely. So from an impacts perspective and from looking at where we are overall, there's a number of things that companies should be thinking about in terms of their talent and what they should be trying to do. So the first is really looking at a talent risk assessment. What does a talent risk assessment mean? Trying to look at who your top performers are, who your high potentials are, the folks that you really want to keep in the work, and making sure that those people that you have a good relationship with those folks, that they're happy in the workplace, that you can try to keep them. So looking at where your potential risks are from a turnover perspective, and really trying to address those risks proactively. That can be done through a number of strategies, trying to look at things from a standpoint of, workloads, which has become a significant issue in today's sort of workplace. A lot of increase in workloads to unsustainable levels as the workforce overall has reduced. Trying to look at the relationships that they have with the company. How happy are they with those relationships? Does it meet their needs? What do their career paths look like? And trying to help in those areas and make sure that people see a career path that they can try to take advantage of. So understanding where that risk is and what some of those issues are and trying to address those proactively so that you don't lose the workers that you don't want to lose. Second, really looking at talent opportunity assessment. And we've seen a lot of this really in organizations right now, trying to take advantage of some of the softness in the economy to do a few different things. One, try to bolster the workforce that they have in hard to find positions. So in some cases, actually overhiring in some key positions like sales or key support roles, et cetera, where they have traditionally had trouble finding talent, actually trying to buffer themselves for as the economy starts to grow back. The second thing is looking at sort of key hires that they can potentially take from other organizations, people who might be unhappy being in organizations where that organization is not doing well, and so they may have been impacted from a pay or an incentive perspective, and really trying to strategically take talent from other companies and bring them over to their side. And we've seen a number of those cases happen, in a number of organizations where they're just stagnant and are having a hard time offering either, the traditional levels of compensation that they've had or the career opportunities that they've had, et cetera. They are people, their competitors are really trying to take advantage of that. We've seen some of those moves. One of the biggest things that organizations need to be focused on right now is their overall employment brand and their overall employment experience, and really rethinking what that's going to look like. I talked about it a little bit earlier in terms of helping some of our clients redefine the workplace and what that's going to look like from a physical perspective, but that also really extends into trying to redefine where they are from an employment brand perspective. What does collaboration mean in the future of work? What does innovation mean? What does it mean to be on a team, and how much work is going to be, virtual versus in person? A lot of those things significantly change the character of the work and frankly, what people signed up for. Take, for example, a workforce who is used to kind of going into the office every day. They have strong social relationships, strong bonds, they have a good culture and they do all those kinds of things. What is that going to look like going forward? Are people still going to have the same ceremonies and rituals and sort of things that made it fun or enjoyable to work in that workplace? What's that going to look like going forward? And it's very important for companies to be proactive and to really redefine that rather than letting it be redefined for them. So early on in the pandemic, as everybody had to very rapidly move remote and things of that nature, companies were sort of letting things happen and seeing where they evolved. The best companies now are really taking more proactive action to look at their culture, to look at their employee experience, and trying to define what that looks like going forward. And then really thinking about how that impacts their employment brand overall, and thinking about rebranding or changing their brand or moving their brand messaging as they start to look at some of those things. So companies are spending a lot of effort and energy to redefine that proactively to make sure that they can continue to be a talent magnet and a desirable place to work. Rethinking employee development is another important piece. Obviously, when we think about things like in-person training, on-the-job training, and how a lot of work or how a lot of that development happens in the workplace, things are going to be different based on the new future of work and what our future workplaces look like, et cetera. But just as important, there are new skills, different sets of skills, things around virtual collaboration, et cetera, that people really need to have. And I know I've mentioned this a number of times in these past webinars, but it's such a critical piece. We really need to be thinking about not only what skills we need to build, but where are there places where we're going to need to reskill. So for example, if we've taken functions and we've moved them from in person to primarily virtual and looking at new service delivery models, things of that nature, how do we really make sure that we are reskilling our workforce to take advantage and to help us in those new models of working? So that's a really important piece of the puzzle. But thinking about how you allocate your development budget, where it's going, what you're using it for, how you're using it is also really critical. The one that's really important and that a lot of organizations are struggling with right now is really dealing with employee health and employee mental health components. This is beyond traditional, sort of wellness programs or those sorts of things that really promote people to, sort of get out and get healthy, but trying to look at, and we're just really getting the early census of data on this, the impact that the pandemic has had on mental health. Some of the data that we're seeing, for example, in adolescents and teenagers is really disturbing. Some of the things that we're starting to see in terms of feelings of isolation, feelings of depression, things of that nature, increase in alcohol use, et cetera. There was just recently a study from RAND Corporation about the increase in binge drinking among adults. There's just a lot of things that we're seeing that are very concerning from a standpoint of employee mental health. It's not really going to be sufficient to just say, hey, well, we have an employee assistance program and how can we, push people over to that when we need help. We need to be able to not only provide resources for the employees as they deal with mental health issues, either for themselves or for their families, but we also need to be able to proactively talk to our managers and help them understand what are the appropriate ways to identify, deal with, interact with, mental health issues in the workplace. This is one of those things that in many organizations we've tried to, in a large way, avoid this as a topic, and it's not something that we traditionally sort of train our managers on unless it's sort of like crisis intervention. But there's really a middle ground there where we really need to help our managers understand and our supervisors understand how do we deal with people who might be struggling, inside or outside the workforce with mental health issues brought on by the pandemic, brought on by the different dynamics that we have there. So a lot of organizations are really struggling right now to come up with what are the right answers, what are the right things that to do in that respect. We'll be doing a webinar probably early next year on that particular topic and focusing more closely on that one, but it's a big piece to look at going forward. Workforce planning is another area, and I know this is one that I've talked about before as well, but what we're finding is that every month trying to forecast what's going to happen from a workforce and a demand perspective becomes more and more difficult as companies continue to see very interesting trends from a revenue perspective. In some cases seeing significantly increased demand, and in places that they may not have expected, in some places seeing overall decreased demand. Companies are really struggling to understand what they need to do from a workforce perspective and to be able to proactively get ahead of those needs. So again, workforce planning really becomes a critical component and a critical competency for HR organizations to have in terms of really being able to do that. I know I've talked about this one before, but if you're not sort of being able to tie external trends into your workforce and what things look like there, that's really a capability that you need to examine and look at, making sure that you have in-house. And finally, really looking at work processes and how we do those work processes, including looking at things like automation and knowledge management. We continue to see organizations who are saying, we've either had to or we want to redefine our work processes. In some cases, the restrictions that they have from a health perspective have forced them to redesign their work processes, either based on capacity limits, social distancing limits, any of those kinds of things. reasons. In other cases, it's just the fact that people aren't together. They can't as easily share knowledge. They can't as easily sort of, lean over the cubicle, so to speak, to use the old cliche, and talk to somebody about something. The increase in use of virtual collaboration platforms and things like that have not been able to compensate for the sort of loss of teamwork and collaboration in a lot of organizations. So many are really trying to proactively rethink, what do their work processes look like. In addition, there's a number of organizations who have started to see dips in productivity where they may have seen initial increases. So many organizations reported that when they initially went virtual, productivity increased and people weren't, in meetings all the time or things like that. And for a number of reasons, they were seeing increases in productivity. But now they're actually starting to see some of that fall back in some of those areas as people get more used to working remotely or things like that, but at the same time may start to see more distractions from, things at home, whatever it might be. So companies have become very concerned about that. Companies are also using this as an opportunity to accelerate some of their digital transformation and other efforts that they had in order to sort of go forward and really understand, okay, what can we do to accelerate moving to more automation, more business intelligence, more analytics, in some cases artificial intelligence, to really help increase the efficiency and effectiveness of our work processes. These last two, workforce planning and the increase in automation, changes in work processes, actually fit together very well in addition. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of companies are seeing sort of unsustainable increases in workloads, as in many cases companies had to do reduction in forces or hiring freezes or things of that nature. And in many cases that's sort of pushed more work onto their existing workforce. A lot of companies from a workforce planning perspective are sort of identifying that and saying, okay, what can we do from a work process, work automation perspective to try to make our workloads more sustainable without necessarily increasing our headcounts? Because most organizations we're seeing are very hesitant to increase their headcounts and sort of bring those costs on and try to drive that into the organization. So these last two pieces kind of fit together in terms of what people are looking at, both how do we improve from a workforce planning perspective and how do we sort of supplement our workforce and improve our workforce through automation, knowledge sharing, knowledge management, and collaboration. So a lot that organizations are doing. I wanted to mention just briefly before I wrap up and take questions. These trends that we're seeing are not unique to, say, large organizations or small organizations or those kinds of things. While the sort of need scales and changes a little bit in character, these areas that we're seeing are really being addressed and being seen by both large organizations and small organizations to different degrees. So when you look at talent risk assessment or talent opportunity assessment, for example, you may not be talking about, a workforce of hundreds of people or thousands of people, but it becomes even more important when you have those, one or two critical producers to be able to really look and make sure that you've got that talent in the right place and that they, that they're, tied to the organization and that they're feeling engaged and productive and those kinds of things. So these trends are not unique to, one company size or another or one industry or another, though they vary a little bit in terms of how they play out and maybe the degree. They are common across, both large and small enterprises and across different industries. But many organizations are really asking what the future of work looks like right now, and we're helping a lot of organizations try to define what that looks like for them. But I think over the next few months, we'll see more and more come out in terms of, models that are working and models that are effective in terms of what the future of work really needs to look like. With that, I will pause and take any questions that people have.
Great, Brian. Thanks so much. Just an incredible amount of information in a short time. So really appreciate all the work that you and the consulting team do and putting together all this content. So we did get a couple of really good questions. The first, you didn't talk about it, but I thought we might get this. How do you expect the election to impact the economy and more on employment trends too related to that?
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting ride, that's for sure. I think that if we see the biggest concern that we see is if there is ongoing social unrest or upheaval associated with the election. So if we have any sorts of challenges to the validity of elections or challenges in transition or things like that, then we see a significant risk of short-term economic impact that could be pretty dramatic. Overall, the stock market, while it's had its volatility, has done pretty well. That would certainly be at significant risk if you started to see some of that instability. We think from a standpoint of if you do start to see social unrest or instability, there's likely to be a further pulling back in terms of employment, jobs, and organizations just being more cautious in terms of what they do until things sort of settle out. I think you could see some different emphasis in terms of the different administrations on work protections, what they focus on from an overall economic perspective, overall economic theory, stimulus theory, et cetera. So we see some changes in that, but sort of the biggest concern we see is any kind of ongoing unrest that would be associated with a kind of contested election. So we're really encouraging organizations to have some contingency plans. What does that look like? How do we protect our workers? How do we make sure that we can stay safe and stay productive if there's any sort of ongoing chaos that needs to be dealt with? I do think that we could also see supply chain disruptions and things of that nature during the height of some of the protests that we've seen over the past several months. Carriers like FedEx and UPS, for example, put in no-go zones and places that they either had delayed delivery or disrupted delivery or things like that. So we could see some supply chain disruptions as well associated if there is ongoing unrest.
Brian, you mentioned risk and safety, and we've been talking a lot about that, not only with unrest, but also with COVID, and starting to see, this HR transformation of risk and safety really becoming a big component of the HR world. And have you been working a lot with companies as far as kind of redefining the HR perspective?
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. We have seen quite a shift in terms of the role of HR through the course of COVID, getting into more traditional, what would traditionally be considered operational issues or some of the harder core safety issues, looking at how employee policy ties into some of those. And generally speaking, HR just done a great job in terms of adapting to that role. But I think that where a lot of them are out now is trying to move from that immediate response of how do we implement the protocols that were mandated or that we want to have in place to, how do we really start to rethink what our new normal, I get tired of that cliche, but that new normal is in terms of a workplace perspective. We're also starting to see that more in the way of standards are starting to be developed. So right now, the US doesn't have a ton of standards in terms of things like personal protective gear and things of that nature, but we know that some of those are going to be coming out probably towards the end of this year that are going to say, okay, if you really want to protect people in a public safety environment or in a medical environment or in an industrial environment, this is the standard of masks or other things that you need to have. When that happens, there's going to be some scrambling to really make sure that everything complies with that. But I think that generally speaking, HR has jumped into that role with both feet, and I think that now they're really starting to look at how does that then tie into all the other things we're doing from a talent development, performance management, culture, brand perspective, and how do we really link those things together.
Good. So we'll jump right into talent because we've got some good questions around that. I love what you said about proactively redefining that experience and instead of letting it be defined for you. And so what are top companies doing in regards to talent? What are you seeing them do that others are not?
First and foremost, it's being proactive. They're really, as I mentioned earlier, as you sort of talked about, trying to get ahead of the curve, not just in terms of employee experience and brand, but some of the mental health issues, redefining performance management, redefining employee development, redefining compensation and what that looks like. I think many organizations sort of have underestimated the impact that these changes in work have had on how they manage performance. And I think some of the productivity slips that organizations are seeing are because of that reality of not having rethought, okay, what does it mean to actually manage performance effectively in a now all virtual or hybrid kind of environment? What does it mean when our our managers interact very differently with their employees. And so they're looking very hard at performance management and how they manage that particular process and what that looks like. The best companies are also really taking that look at employee development and tying that in, and proactively looking at reskilling, proactively looking at how all of those things work together. So I think organizations are trying to, find those new strategies, those new ways of working, or at least the ones that are being very proactive are trying to do that. I think in many cases, what that's leading to, or what we're seeing so far, is they're still able to be a talent magnet and attract talent out of their industry. Company, or I should say workers, pay attention to what companies are doing, how they're reacting in this particular time, and they have long memories about those things. So when they feel safe making a move, when they feel like they're in a position where they can move from one company to another, they're looking at these companies that are being more proactive and are sort of adapting to the new world better than maybe the company that they're in.
Yeah, great points. You mentioned so many powerful numbers today, but 1.4 million jobs that are not being created, and employers' needs are still there. And so what are you seeing as far as labor sourcing strategies that companies are using when they may not be able to necessarily add headcount? Are they discontinuing their progress or finding alternate ways?
Yeah, good question, and probably one of the areas we've seen some of the most significant shifts in terms of how companies are approaching things. So when you look at labor sourcing, hiring somebody is definitely no longer the default, but trying to think creatively around how can we source this particular labor need, whether it's through some kind of contingent arrangement, contract consultant, that sort of thing, whether it's looking at can we, partially outsource or find a way to source this in order to not permanently add to our workforce, but be able to get the work done that we need to have done. So a lot of organizations are really becoming more flexible, more creative in terms of how they source their labor. But that's also coming with some issues, because in many organizations, they don't necessarily have the right infrastructure for effectively managing, larger contingent arrangements, more sort of, sourcing relationships that they have out there. And so, they have procurement rules and things like that, but it's not really set up to optimize that contingent labor workforce that they're using. So while many companies are sort of shifting their emphasis away from, full-time employees or employees in general to more flexible and more creative sourcing arrangements, many of them are struggling then with the impact of that productivity, compliance, security, a number of those things that come with, having a higher percentage of the workforce that's really contingent. And it really ties into a trend that we have been seeing for a while now of especially larger companies having a more closely aligned blend of full-time versus contingent labor, but now we're starting to see that move into medium and smaller size companies as well.
Great. So a couple of questions on your insight around industries that are doing well during this time. So, I know we've heard some about tech. What are other areas or sectors that are doing well right now?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at the different industries, sometimes it's not just a matter of the industry as a whole, but it's sort of segments within those industries that are doing better than others. So it's a little bit nuanced in terms of some of those things. But as you said, tech overall is doing well from an industry perspective, both in terms of trying to maintain from an economic perspective, but also in terms of trying to get out ahead of some of these issues related to employment, related to brand, related to workplace. So there's that trend is out there. Another segment where it's very differential, but you're seeing in certain parts of manufacturing actually start to do very well. So companies who have products that are needed or more in demand now because of the pandemic, as well as people seeing a lot of disruption from an offshore supply chain perspective, and trying to look at how can we nearshore or onshore more of that supply chain. So a lot of companies from a manufacturing perspective are starting to see significant increases in terms of their work. they're also on those front lines because there's only so much virtual that they can do, and so they're having to redefine their workplaces at a very rapid rate, and sort of move in that direction. So a lot of those industries are starting to see improvements, both from an economic perspective as well as sort of how they re-evolve and how they evolve their workplace and workforce. So beyond that, I mean, it's very uneven in terms of where some of the recovery is, et cetera. You're seeing subsegments and those kinds of things that are starting to increase. There's not any one place that we would point to right now that's sort of sustainably doing well, but it's more sort of, do you have something that fits the times, and if so, you're tending to be on the upswing of that.
Great. Well, we had a question about a small, and I think when they say small and under 100 employees and small to mid-size, I guess, and they wanted to know, hey, of all these things that I should be thinking about now as an employer of 100 employees, what are the most important? And I think you touched on some of that with talent, that it's not just for the large employers now. So what's your advice there?
Yeah, when I look at the list, I mean, I think it's really sort of three things. One, making sure that you protect that critical talent, those folks that are really critical to your business operating, whether those are key salespeople, key operations leaders, whatever that might be. So that's kind of first and foremost, and making sure that you've got that squared away. The second thing is really that piece around employee well-being and helping to manage some of those mental health, employee relations kinds of issues, and making sure that that's kind of settled. And then the third thing would really be in the realm of rethinking what I would call the employee experience. Development, performance management, some of those talent management processes. So focus, if there's kind of one theme in all of that, it's really focus on that relationship with the employees and trying to keep in balance sort of what the company needs for it to be happy with its employees and what the employees need for them to be happy with the company. And the more you can sort of think in those terms and try to look at how well that equation is balanced, that'll help you make sure that you're sort of covering the right things to keep your workforce stable, keep your workforce productive, and sort of move in the directions that you need to move.
Thanks for that. And, another question around, you mentioned early in your presentation around companies reevaluating their physical and space and geographic location. And could you talk more about that, about what you're seeing and trends from a kind of location analysis standpoint?
Yeah, it's there's a lot going on there right now. So I think that there was a thinking at one point that organizations would just largely stay virtual, right? It seemed to be working well enough, and they would sort of figure their way around that. And many companies were considering, keeping the virtual arrangements that they had in place sort of indefinitely. More recently, the past 3 months, we've seen a lot of organizations saying, "Yeah, I don't think that's really going to work. I don't think that we can sustain this true, 100% virtual or mostly virtual kinds of environments." So, from a workplace perspective, people have been experimenting with a lot of different things. The sort of hybrid scenarios of having certain people come in on certain days, et cetera, haven't seemed to do very well with organizations. So what we are seeing that's working is one, rethinking the physical configuration of the workspace, putting more space in there. And I know that's been the reverse of where we've been going for a long time, and we've been trying to stuff more and more people into smaller spaces, but that's been, reversed in terms of that trend, not only from a standpoint of health and safety guidelines, but frankly, just in terms of employees feeling safe and feeling comfortable about, the work environments that they're in. Thinking about how they can better structure collaboration and encourage sort of targeted collaboration. So, not necessarily having people in the office every day all the time, but do we have sort of designated windows where we really want to bring, a significant portion of the workforce in, and trying to deal with some of those, and of course trying to match that up with, physical restrictions and social distancing guidelines. But, more and more organizations are trying to find what's that balance between, the traditional physical workspace where everybody comes in all the time, where versus, a sort of targeted collaboration hybrid kind of model. I wouldn't say that I've seen anybody who's gotten it exactly right now, but I think what we're trending more and more towards is organizations who can really create a flexible workspace where people still feel safe to come in and to work and to collaborate and those kinds of things. I think that the one trend that I'm pretty certain around is that some of the more for lack of a better term, sort of solo work kinds of functions where people sort of tend to work on their own and don't work with the team as much. I think a lot of those functions will probably continue to stay virtual or primarily virtual as they look at it. But everybody's trying to reconcile this with, sort of the existing leases that they have and things like that. What we're seeing in terms of new lease acquisition, new trends in space acquisition, et cetera, I mean, it's just in a lot of ways sort of bottomed out because most organizations are unwilling or very hesitant to sign long-term deals in terms of leases. And so the traditional structure of corporate leases and those kinds of things are really being challenged because as companies try to figure out what they want things to look like in the future. But I think where we're heading is more of a hybrid sort of arrangement from that perspective. But I don't think there's one model yet that we've gotten to that says, this is exactly how everybody's going to do it.
Yeah, I think we're hearing more about, trying to find that balance, between virtual and physical location, and people are trending more away from the total virtual setting and, for the future. So, had a good question about some of the, generational differences in the workforce and, just looking at the data around the number of people in the workforce and extrapolating that to layoffs and companies that are having a hard time. And the question is, if companies have gone through this process of layoffs and making an assumption that there may be a disproportionate percentage of baby boomers or people that have vast experience, what are you hearing companies struggling with that, and what are they doing with, thinking about that experience that they may have lost in a layoff or a downturn?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would say they're not being as proactive about that as they should be. I think it's varying quite a bit by industry. In some industries, it's tending to be more the younger, less experienced workers who are losing their jobs, and the theory is kind of like we can take an experienced person and do the job of 2 or 3 people, as unsustainable as that may be. But that's right. The approach that some companies are taking and looking at it. And then there's another flip side that we're seeing in some industries, which says, what, we're kind of rethinking all the ways that we are doing work. We're rethinking, how we use technology and those kinds of things. And we're going to make our bets on people who may be more adaptable to technology. And obviously that's a stereotype, but, and that kind of thing. So it's really varying quite a bit in terms of company and industry of who's getting impacted. We haven't seen a lot of really good data as of yet. And part of that is that state unemployment systems are very uneven in terms of what they can report and how good those numbers are. So it's one of the things that we've been trying to get a better handle on, but so far there's not super good data in terms of those age-related, generation-related trends. But anecdotally, those are some of the things that we're seeing in terms of how companies are handling it. I think personally that what I've seen in some of the clients that I've worked with that's worked well is really thinking about skills and what skills you're going to need going forward in order to be successful, and thinking about, how do we really hit the right segments of the workforce in order to map to those skills. And, again, that comes back to workforce planning, being able to identify those skills proactively and really look at it from a standpoint of what do we need, not just in skills at a high level, but what kinds of numbers, et cetera. So I think that'll help organizations avoid sort of these over, sweeping generalizations about kind of generations and things like that.
Good. Yeah, great comments and the focus on skills there. So I think we have time for one more question, and it's interesting because we've been grappling with this ourselves within HRQ and Landrum HR. So what are you seeing about trends at bringing leaders together, people that are across the country, other groups for development and training? Are we starting to see that come back some, or still mainly focusing, on the virtual environment?
We're definitely starting to see it come back. I think people are taking, you can call it calculated risks, but, organizations are looking at, there's only so long we can go without, having those kinds of in-person collaborations, and whether that's for, strategic planning, whether that's for development, whatever it might be, we are seeing organizations spending a lot of time and thinking very carefully about how do we put the right protocols in place to be able to make that happen. But yeah, I mean, from a standpoint of even our work, we're doing more work on client sites when we need to, and things like that. So yeah, we are definitely seeing an increase in in-person collaboration. Companies are being very careful about, making sure that they're doing contact tracing and things of that nature if they do have any sort of, positive tests or things of that nature. So a lot of companies feel comfortable enough with the policy framework that they've put in place to be able to have that sort of limited collaboration. Are they bringing people together for weekly executive team meetings? No, they're not doing that. But, in terms of those sort of periodic, whether they're development, whether they're planning related, et cetera, we are seeing much more of that.
Well, Brian, it's gone by fast. It always does. I want to thank everybody for attending today. And Brian, thanks again so much for your effort and the team's effort in putting all this content together. Just a reminder that if you registered, then you will be receiving a link to this recording. And we'd love your feedback on a quick survey as we exit today. So on behalf of HRQ and Landrum HR, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Brian.